What you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented, confirmed, and almost entirely forgotten crime. On a quiet Sunday evening in August of 1971, the value of the money sitting in your grandfather's wallet was quietly, permanently, and deliberately changed forever. He didn't warn Congress. He didn't warn the world. He didn't even warn his own Treasury staff until the very last moment. In one 12-minute television broadcast, a single man severed the last thread connecting the American dollar to something real, something you could hold, something that could not simply be created out of thin air. They called it temporary. They called it necessary. 53 years later, that temporary measure has never once been reversed. This is the story of the Nixon Shock. The weekend the United States defaulted, quietly, on a promise made to the entire world. And the moment your future stopped being guaranteed by gold and started being guaranteed by nothing at all. This is financial history. And this is the day they stole your future. To understand what was stolen, you first have to understand what was promised. In July of 1944, as the guns of the Second World War were still audible in the distance, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a resort hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire to design the financial architecture of the world that would follow. The agreement they signed was simple in theory and revolutionary in practice. The United States dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other currency on Earth would then be pegged to the dollar. In effect, the world's money supply was chained, link by link, to a finite, physical, glittering metal buried in vaults. For nearly 2 decades, it worked. It gave the world stability. It gave nations discipline. And it gave ordinary people something precious, the certainty that a dollar today would still be a dollar tomorrow. But by the late 1960s, that discipline was cracking under a weight it was never designed to carry. A war in Vietnam, an expanding welfare state, and a government that had grown addicted to spending money it did not actually have. Washington was printing dollars faster than Fort Knox could ever back them with gold, and the rest of the world was beginning to notice. France's President Charles de Gaulle grew suspicious first. He began sending French warships across the Atlantic for one single purpose: to physically collect France's gold and remove it from American vaults before the promise broke. Other nations quietly followed his lead, and by the summer of 1971, America's gold reserves were vanishing at a terrifying pace. On August 13, 1971, 15 men were secretly summoned to Camp David. Nixon's advisors, Treasury officials. Not a single foreign leader was informed. Not a single member of Congress was consulted. For 2 days, behind locked doors, they debated a decision that would rewrite the financial rules of every nation on Earth, without asking a single one of them for permission. And on the evening of August 15th, the world found out, live, on television, with almost no warning at all. What he said in the next 12 minutes would end the gold standard, shake the global economy, and quietly begin eroding the value of your money. Every single year, from that moment forward. Camp David was supposed to be a place of rest, a retreat from the pressures of Washington. But on the weekend of August 13th, 1971, it became something else entirely, a war room. 15 men arrived by helicopter, one by one, sworn to secrecy before they even stepped off the landing pad. Among them, Treasury Secretary John Connally, a Texan with a gift for blunt persuasion, and a young economist named Volcker, a man who would later become one of the most powerful central bankers in American history. They were not there to discuss policy in the abstract. They were there because the numbers had become undeniable, and undeniable numbers do not wait for congressional approval. In just the first 2 weeks of August, foreign banks had demanded that the United States convert nearly $3 billion into gold. At the rate reserves were vanishing, economists warned that Fort Knox itself could be empty within months. The United States government was facing a question no superpower ever wants to answer publicly. What happens when the richest nation on earth cannot keep the promise printed on its own currency? Connolly's answer was simple, and in hindsight, chilling in its confidence. He reportedly told the room that foreigners were out to screw the United States, and that it was their job, in his words, to screw them first. There were technically other options on the table: raise interest rates, cut government spending, devalue the dollar formally through international negotiation. All of them were slower. All of them required consensus. All of them meant admitting weakness before the world was ready to hear it. Nixon chose the fastest option instead: unilateral, unannounced, and irreversible. He would simply close the gold window, suspend, without warning, the ability of any foreign government to exchange their dollars for American gold. A promise that had stood since 1944, the promise that anchored the entire post-war financial world, would be broken in a single afternoon by 15 men in a cabin in the Maryland mountains. On Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, an estimated 80 million Americans sat down in front of their televisions, expecting to watch the popular Western series Bonanza. Instead, their programming was interrupted. A somber announcer informed them that President Nixon would be addressing the nation immediately on a matter of urgent importance. Nixon appeared at his desk, calm, composed, and reassuring, the practiced tone of a man about to deliver devastating news wrapped in the language of strength and stability. He spoke of jobs. He spoke of inflation. He spoke of protecting the American worker from what he called speculators and international money traders. And then, almost in passing, he said the words that would end an era. He announced that he had directed the Treasury to suspend, temporarily, the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That single word would go on to define one of the greatest broken promises in modern financial history. Most viewers that night did not fully grasp what they had just witnessed. It sounded technical. It sounded temporary. It sounded, frankly, boring. In reality, it was the moment every currency on earth became what economists call fiat money, value backed by nothing more than trust in a government's promise and the quiet authority to print more of it whenever convenient. The following Monday, stock markets surged in celebration. Wall Street cheered. Nixon's approval ratings climbed. It was, by nearly every immediate measure, a political triumph. But beneath that celebration, a slower, quieter, and far more permanent transformation had just begun, one whose true cost would not be measured in days or months, but in decades. Temporary is one of the most dangerous words in the English language when it comes from the mouth of a government. And nowhere was that more true than in the decade that followed August of 1971. Almost immediately, the dollar began to lose its anchor. Without gold to restrain it, the government now had a tool it had never fully possessed before: the ability to create money whenever political convenience demanded it. And so it did. Between 1971 and 1981, The money supply expanded at a pace the United States had never before witnessed during peacetime. The consequences arrived quickly, and they arrived at the dinner table. By 1974, inflation in the United States had climbed above 11% in a single year, a number that, today, would be considered an economic emergency. By the end of the decade, it was worse. In 1979 and 1980, inflation surged past 13%, cutting the real value of every paycheck, every pension, and every savings account in the country. For a retiree who had spent 40 years diligently saving, this was not an abstract statistic. It was watching a lifetime of discipline quietly evaporate, 1 percentage point at a time, with no vote, no warning, and no recourse. Economists call this phenomenon the inflation tax. It is never voted on by any legislature. It is never announced with a press conference. It simply happens, silently, in the background of everyday life. It would take until 1979 and a new Federal Reserve chairman named Paul Volcker, the very same economist who had been in that cabinet Camp David, to finally break inflation's grip. His method was brutal. He raised interest rates to nearly 20%, deliberately triggering a recession in order to strangle inflation out of the economy entirely. Millions of Americans lost their jobs. Farmers lost their land. Small businesses collapsed under interest rates that made borrowing nearly impossible. It worked, but the price was staggering. What almost no one connected at the time was the deeper truth. This entire decade of chaos, the inflation, the interest rate shock, the recession, traced its roots directly back to a single television broadcast in August of 1971. And the effects never truly stopped. Since 1971, the U.S. dollar has lost roughly 85% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 then costs nearly $7 today. Meanwhile, wages for ordinary workers have not kept pace. Assets, however, stocks, real estate, gold, the things owned disproportionately by the wealthy, have soared in value. This is the quiet, unspoken legacy of the Nixon Shock. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a slow, widening gap between those who own assets and those who simply earn a wage. It is why a house that cost a modest sum in 1971 now requires decades of saving. It is why a single income once supported a family, and now, for many, 2 incomes barely do. None of this was an accident of nature. It was the accumulated, compounding consequence of a decision made by 15 men in a cabin on a single weekend in August. There is a question historians still argue about today. Did Richard Nixon truly have no other choice on that August weekend? Or did he simply choose the option that was easiest, fastest, and most politically convenient? The alternatives were real. A negotiated devaluation, done in coordination with allies, could have preserved some link between money and something tangible. It would have been slower. It would have required humility. It would have meant admitting weakness on the world stage. Instead, Nixon chose the path that required no permission from anyone. A single announcement, a single Sunday evening, a decision that could be made by 15 men instead of 44 nations. In the decades since, that same convenience has become the default setting of modern monetary policy. When economies falter, the answer is rarely restraint. It is almost always more money, created a little faster than before. In 2008, faced with a financial crisis, the Federal Reserve created trillions of dollars through a policy called quantitative easing. In 2020, faced with a pandemic, it did so again. on a scale that dwarfed every previous expansion in American history. Each time, the justification sounded reasonable. Each time, officials called the measure temporary. And each time, the money that was created never fully disappeared again. This is the true legacy of August 1971. Not simply a single broken promise, but the creation of a permanent precedent. The idea that money itself could be treated as infinitely flexible whenever those in power decided it should be. You have likely felt this yourself, without ever connecting it to a broadcast from over 50 years ago. The rising cost of groceries, the climbing price of a home, the quiet sense that a dollar simply does not go as far as it used to. This is not a story about politics or about choosing sides between left and right. It is a story about a structural decision made without public consent that continues to shape the economic reality of every single person alive today. Some economists argue this system, for all its flaws, gave governments the flexibility needed to respond to crises no gold standard could have survived. Others argue it simply transferred wealth quietly, decade after decade, from savers to those who already held assets. Both arguments contain truth, and that tension between flexibility and discipline, between convenience and restraint, remains unresolved to this very day. What is certain is this: the dollar in your pocket today is backed by nothing but trust. Trust in institutions, trust in restraint, and trust that promises made by governments will eventually be kept. History suggests that trust is fragile. History suggests that promises called temporary have a way of becoming permanent. And history suggests that the people who understand this earliest are the people best equipped to protect themselves. This has been the story of the Nixon Shock, the weekend a promise was broken, and the quiet, compounding cost that has followed every generation since. If this documentary changed the way you see the money in your own wallet, subscribe to Financial History, because the next hidden story is already waiting to be told. Thank you for watching. This has been Financial History.